nuclear power. Often, when this type of energy is suggested, it induces fear in the crowd. But why? Compared to other forms of energy, nuclear has failed significantly less, and when it has failed, some incidents have zero casualties, like 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Today on Gulf Streams, we're going to delve into the history of nuclear power to pinpoint what exactly it is that causes such fear when considering this form of energy and subsequently its reemergence. I'm Jaden Brayboys, a student researcher at Rice University working on Gulf Streams, and alongside me is Naman Retzendor, another student and researcher with this program, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT, Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime there are podcasts available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Today we have the pleasure of talking to Dr. Mark Walker, a history professor at Union College in New York. He specializes in European history with a focus on modern German history. His expertise includes the history of science and technology, particularly nuclear history and human evolution, as well as the intersection of science, technology, politics, and ideology. He explores big history, tracing the narrative from the origins of the universe to the present. Dr. Walker is also the author of German National Socialism and the Quest for Nuclear Power, 1939-1949, Science, Technology, and Socialism, Nazi Science, Myth, Truth, and the German Atomic Bomb, and his newest book, Hitler's Atomic Bomb, History, Legend, and the Twin Legacies of Auschwitz and Hiroshima, which can be purchased online or at a bookstore near you. With that, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and welcome to Gulf Streams.
Thank you.
So I think the first question we have for you, would you mind walking us through like a brief overview of the history of nuclear power, emphasizing any significant achievements, challenges, or key insights that you have that you think are essential for people to understand when this topic comes up?
By nuclear power, you mean electricity production?
Yes,
Yes, and not nuclear weapons.
correct. Well, you can include that if you would like to, but
Well, of course, nuclear weapons came first with the atomic bomb that was built during the war and dropped on two Japanese cities in August of 45. Um, the American government in particular was looking for peaceful uses of this technology, both because the technology might be useful, but also for foreign policy reasons to make it look as if the US was not only concerned with weapons. Now, one obvious application would be nuclear reactors get hot. You can use them to boil water, generate steam, run a turbine. All power plants essentially burn something or generate steam somehow to run a turbine and generate electricity. But the first nuclear reactor was actually designed to be put on a nuclear submarine in the 1950s. And that's relevant because you did for a nuclear reactor in a submarine, it's important that it be very small and very compact. And so this design was good for submarines, but not necessarily good for other applications. But when the US government came to want to encourage or support or push a nuclear power industry, there were two American companies, Westinghouse and General Electric, that had worked together to design this nuclear reactor for submarines, and they simply expanded the model, and that became the type of nuclear power plant that's the most common nuclear power plant that exists in the world today. And it uses ordinary water as a moderator. A moderator is a substance that slows neutrons down. Um, and it uses enriched uranium-235, that is uranium where there are two isotopes of uranium, uranium-235, which is easy to fission, and a pure mass of uranium-235 is what was detonated over Hiroshima. And uranium-238, which is much more common, that tends to absorb neutrons, but it will transmute into transuranic elements, including plutonium, which is then also just as easy to fission as uranium-235. Um, So, and the United States also had very large uranium-235 separation plants that they built during the war, so they could use for that purpose. So the first nuclear power plants and the model that U.S. companies exported was not ideal for generating electricity. There were other models that might have been better that they were not taken up. Um, the U.S. government, of course, is capitalist, and there's often a reluctance, depending on the party, which party's in power, to do anything that seems a little too socialist. And so the US government wanted to encourage nuclear power because private companies were not willing to take the risk to start it by themselves. But the US government was also not willing to do what, for example, France did. France simply built nuclear reactors for the French government. They're run by the French government. So that what the US did is it stepped in as the insurer guarantee. Insurance for nuclear power plants is very expensive because things can go wrong. And the US government, at least at first, said, we will cover the insurance. You just need to come up with the capital to build the things. And so these were the first nuclear power plants. It was in the early 1970s with the so-called oil shock. That's when the Middle Eastern countries who produce oil, the beginning of OPEC, the Organization for the Petroleum Exporters. Um, they wanted to exert some political influence because of recent wars and conflicts that had gone on in the Middle East, Israel with its neighbors, so which shows that nothing is really new. Um, and of course, they severely restricted production, which made the price of oil go up, which caused inflation in the United States, which made Americans and American voters very unhappy. Um, but it also gave a boost to nuclear power because the argument was, or the idea was, we need to be energy self-sufficient, and nuclear power is one way to do that. So it's in the early 70s, you get a boom of orders for nuclear power plants. Although even by this time, and we haven't had a major accident yet, even by this time, nuclear power was already seen as expensive, and nuclear power plants are very complicated. There are lots of things that can go wrong. And of course, in 1979, there's an accident at the Three Mile Island plant in Pennsylvania. Um, mm, no one has ever proven that anyone was seriously hurt, but very many people were terrified. And I don't, as far as I understand it, not a single new power plant was ordered in the United States after the Three Mile Island accident. Interestingly, there have been a few power plants that have just gone online during the last 5 years. These were delayed for decades for various reasons, right? Um, uh, the export of, and of course, nuclear power plants, any machine, complicated machine, has a certain life when you expect you need to, sh to shut it down and get rid of it, replace it. But for nuclear power plants, there were things at first that they didn't understand. For example, that years of sustained exposure to radiation actually crumbles concrete.
Mhm.
And so the plants were less safe. There's opportunities for radiation to leak out. But what the United States, well, the government has encouraged, but because nuclear power plants are run by private companies and states, is that they've encouraged them to hang on as long as possible with patches and quick fixes, um, because that's a way to make money. You've already invested money in the plant. If you can get more out of it, that makes sense. But replacing it with a new one is now very expensive, especially in the US because the safety regulations are much higher, but also because insurance companies would require an awful lot of money for insurance, and the US government is not now offering to pay that. Um, Nuclear power was exported beginning in well, probably 1960s. as part of this Atoms for Peace plan. And the American model, which sounded great at the time, was the countries actually had to, we provided the enriched uranium fuel, and they actually had to send the spent fuel rods back to us, and then we'd give them new ones. And so we accumulated a lot of nuclear waste that way. But the Soviet Union was also offering power plants, and several were built in socialist countries or third world countries. For a short period of time, Canada and Britain and France tried to export nuclear power plants. Some of these used heavy water as a moderator, which is water where the hydrogen has an extra neutron, which is a very good moderator, but it's expensive to make. But I mention all this because there's something that was clear from the very beginning, but which governments have not wanted to admit, and I call it the technological duality of nuclear power. If you have a nuclear power plant, any nuclear power plant, you can use it to make plutonium. So you can
Oh,
use it to
interesting.
make a weapon. Now, it's true that if you, on one hand, want to build a plutonium factory, and on the other hand, you want to build a nuclear power plant that's efficient at generating electricity, they'll be very different. So
Hmm.
the nuclear power plant will not produce plutonium as efficiently as the plutonium factory. But several countries that the nuclear proliferation, when other countries beyond the United States and the Soviet Union, Britain and France, which were the first four, um, uh, started making atomic bombs, they got it through these reactors. In the Indian bomb, they received reactors from Canada and France. Um, Pakistan received reactors from Britain and France. Israel received reactors from the US. Now, Israel doesn't admit that it has nuclear weapons, but everybody knows that it has nuclear weapons. And South Africa actually had nuclear atomic bombs for a while, and then they got rid of them before the apartheid, I think, before the apartheid regime ended. Um, so nuclear power has led to nuclear weapons proliferation. It's not the only way that countries can get nuclear weapons. For example, Iran, which also got reactors from Britain and the Soviet Union, but they are using centrifuges. Clearly their intention is to just make uranium-235 bombs without reactors. Um, so nuclear power, but however, um, the and the Chernobyl accident in the 1980s in the Soviet Union was the first real major accident. Often in the West in America, they say, well, the Soviets had a primitive, inferior reactor design. That's not really true. They had a reactor design that was to be made so it could both efficiently make plutonium for the nuclear weapons plant and electricity. Um, but just like Three Mile Island happened because of a mechanical problem and people overreacted, the Chernobyl accident was mainly human error. But it was a catastrophic accident leading to a huge amount of radiation released. Dozens of people died, definitely from radiation exposure. And since then, people have argued whether or not, but since so much radiation was put into the air, that it probably raised cancer rates by a certain percentage around the world, especially in Europe. But that's nothing you can prove, right? Um, Then nuclear power seemed to be making a comeback with the greater recognition of the problems of climate change, because most industrialized countries use an electrical grid, like in the United States. It's essentially a network of wires that we put electricity in. And the way it works is if the grid's always full, then you can tap a little out from any place and people get their electricity. But somewhere else, you have to be putting electricity back in because you need to keep the grid full of electricity. And solar power and wind power are great, but they don't There's no solar power in the middle of the night, and there's no wind power, no wind. Um, so the grid needs power plants where you can just flick a switch and put electricity in anytime you need to. And right now we do that with coal and oil and natural gas plants, but or nuclear power plants. So it's been the future is clear. We go to all electrical stuff and we figure out how to generate electricity without burning fossil fuels, and we practically solve the problem, right? Although it's a little harder than that. Um, but right now, the only source of electricity, of power that you can just flick on and off, that you could connect to a grid, would be nuclear power.
Right.
So nuclear power was starting to make a comeback, at least in the perception. And in countries other than the US, in Korea and China and Taiwan, they've been building nuclear power plants, and Russia has continued to build a few nuclear power plants. And France just announced it was going to build some more. But then came the accident at Fukushima, which caused some countries like Germany to close down all their nuclear power plants. Now, this was an example of um, the plant was 1970s American technology. So, and the Japanese company was famous and is still famous for not wanting to admit that things are going wrong and trying to cover things up if they think it'll the more thorough. If a thorough repair would cost a lot of money, they prefer to cover it up and try to save money. Um, but this was caused by a tsunami caused by an earthquake. Now you can argue that they should have so it knocked out all the power in the generators, and they had no electricity, and that's why the three reactors melted down. Now the tsunami wall was considered high enough in the 1970s, um, but in the meantime, many people had pointed out that you really need to raise it a little higher because we've been having bigger earthquakes and higher tsunamis. But again, that would have cost money, and the Japanese government did not make them do that, so they didn't do that. Um, Now, about 10 years has passed since Fukushima. And so now, once again, there's a greater interest, at least in theory, that we need nuclear power to save the world from climate change. Um, and what I've noticed for a long time there's very little investment in new types of nuclear reactors. That there are many scientists and engineers over the years who have proposed ones that use thorium so you can't make bombs out of them, ones that can't melt down, little ones you make in a factory and you just take out and you bring back. But no one has really ever sold one of these new designs to a company and they built it on large scale. And these companies that have these new designs all kind of go broke after a while. And in fact, they start off with large government grants because the US government is willing to fund research into this, but not willing to take on the major costs. So part of the problem is we're still building old style nuclear reactors when there surely are better kinds. But you know, someone or some government would have to come up with a lot of money, and that is divert money away from other things to decide we're going to spend it on this. For the American government in the 50s, this was very easy because this was a Cold War, and nuclear weapons and the nuclear power industry was just a necessary investment. But now it's not seen that way.
Well, thank you so much for that. That was really, really great. But I think just to build off of that,
People are still very fearful when we hear of the possibility of bringing back nuclear energy. And do you think, since this is all public information, that like it took a tsunami and an earthquake for Fukushima and nobody was hurt and or nobody died in Three Mile Island, that there will be a little bit more public support, or do you think that there still will be a lot of pushback in the coming years?
There's a there's a field of science called risk assessment. It was created in the 70s. And one of the reasons it was created was to study the 3 Mile Island accident. And essentially, you look, especially large technological systems, it's a way of determining what's the probability that something's going to go wrong and the probability that it would lead to a catastrophic accident. And it's interesting, and this was also famously applied to the space shuttle. And the scientists concluded that, well, the space shuttle was very complicated. It wasn't an ideal design. And you would you would expect a certain number of catastrophic accidents every so often, and that's pretty much the number we had too. But if you tell the American people, well, we're going to have a space shuttle program or a rocket program, and every 100 launches, everybody on board is going to die, then people say, we don't want that.
Right.
Now,
Understandably.
originally, when we first started flying in airplanes across the country, they weren't as safe as today. The thing about nuclear, there's many people have done comparisons that you can argue that coal plants are killing every year. They kill far more people than we ever killed nuclear power plants because they put the small particulate pollution in the air that people breathe. It increases lung cancer, all these things. So it's not as it's if you can make an argument if you want to be rational about dangers and costs, then we should build nuclear power plants. But I don't think this is rational. I think this is in part irrational. And I know I was a graduate student living in Germany when the Chernobyl accident happened. And I was doing my dissertation on nuclear stuff, so I knew something about it. And um, I listened to the news broadcasts and I listened to local politicians um, saying things that I knew were nonsense. For example, as one politician came and said, "Well, because radioactive rain had come from Ukraine west and had deluged Germany and France and these countries, so that so they got into radioactivity from that." So I was listening to a politician explain, I know people are concerned about the radiation, but don't worry. It might be a problem for the spinach crop, but we plowed the spinach crop, so no worries. And then news pointed out that in Germany, Germany and France share a border. And in Kael, a city on the eastern side of the Rhine River in Germany, all the outdoor food markets were closed, but across the river in Strasbourg, France, they were open because the French government said there's no problem. And people joked about there being an invisible anti-radioactive wall above the Rhine River, which of course isn't true. Um, but this most striking example is that the Deutsches Museum is a large science and technology museum in Munich. And I mentioned this is radioactive rain. And they had one of the exhibits, they had a Geiger counter that would go off when it detected radiation. And of course, it was just sitting there. But more and more people came in with their wet jackets and they gradually built up radioactivity in the room so that the counter started going off. Now, you're running the museum. What would you choose to do?
Publicize it.
No, the person at the museum will shut the counter off. We don't want to scare people.
Right.
Rather than say, your jackets are so radioactive from the rain that you're making this thing go off. Don't tell them that. No, no, no. Just let them see the exhibits and walk around with their radioactive jackets and go home, right? This is the natural reaction. But I mention all this because I was there at the time, and there is something unnerving about a radioactive threat because you can't sense it, right? air pollution, for example, I live in the Northeast, and this summer a little bit, but the summer before there were massive wildfires in Quebec, and for the first time we had air quality alerts in my area. And you
Mhm.
could actually, if you went out, you noticed there was something different in the air, right? I could sense there was something different in the air. Um, and some dangers you see, and some dangers you smell, and some dangers you hear. But radiation, you can't. I mean, it's a good chance you've had X-rays. In fact, nowadays everyone has X-rays in their teeth at least. Um, you know, the buzz you hear is they make it buzz so that the person doing the radiation therapy or exams steps out of the room. You know, otherwise you don't know that radiation is going through your teeth or going through your arm. Um, and so there is that people are just frightened of it.
Right.
But it's also that I th I think often people want simple answers to complex questions. So nuclear power bad, um, coal I don't notice, so let's just keep burning it. You know, so
No, absolutely. Well, thank you. So just would love to hear your thoughts on how do you see the interaction between like nuclear technologies and political ideologies influencing our global policies presently, but also in the future?
well, I'm a historian, and
Right. So, yeah.
and what historians understand 30 years later is different from what the smartest, most best informed person who keeps up with the news could possibly know. So, um, in the 50s and 60s, the American government was saying, well, we just need to stop nuclear proliferation of weapons. But we know from our people who looked at archival documents and done research that it was clear in the 50s to the American government, we're not going to stop this. Everybody's going to get them. We can't possibly stop. Everybody's going to get them. We should
Right.
try to slow it down. We should try to stop it, of course, or we should really try to stop it when we think the countries will be unfriendly to us. And if countries are likely to be our allies, then it's not so bad, right? But
Right.
as I said, it's the hardest. It was hardest for the Americans and emigres the first time to make the atomic bomb. Because for a long time they weren't certain it would work at all, and there were many different things they had to try, and it is massive effort, very wasteful because they were trying four different things and one had to work, right? The Soviet Union um, had the benefit of some stolen intelligence, but mainly they had the benefit of simply knowing that it was possible, and they had good
Mhm.
scientists and engineers, but they also spent 4 years and massive efforts. The Soviet citizens had essentially had very little to eat for the last few years of World War II, and that continued for another 5 years because they were sacrificing everything to make an atomic bomb to catch up with the Americans. But with every new country, it becomes easier um, because the scientific principle, once you know something works and you can figure out in a scientist or engineer can figure out in general how they must have done it, and then you just need to work it out. It's
Mhm.
really about um, whether or not you can get a hold of fissionable material, or fissile is actually the right adjective, fissile material, uranium-235 or plutonium. In fact, the world is swimming in plutonium. Countries like Sweden and Germany and France have huge piles of plutonium, and you only need about this much for a bomb, right? Um, it's because of their nuclear power plants, and for a while, they thought that, well, maybe to be on the safe side, we better stockpile some plutonium. We might use it someday. Uranium-235 is harder to get at, but it's still not that hard. Now, I don't know of any country that's stolen plutonium from another country. but first Pakistan stole centrifuge technology and they were sold nuclear reactor technology, and then Pakistan or someone from Pakistan sold those both to the North Koreans. Um, the Israelis, the Americans finally said, "Oh, we really don't want you to do this," and the Israelis said, "Fine." And then they got a reactor from the French and did it anyway. Um, Everyone knows how to do it, and it's easy for any country's engineers or scientists to by now to read essentially how to do it. I mean, um, I know how to build a hydrogen bomb. Now I couldn't build it, but I know in principle how to do it.
That's
So,
good.
so it's just much easier to get them now.
Right.
And latest newcomer is North Korea, and it clearly feels very threatened by the U.S. It's this old-fashioned Stalinist regime. Um, its ruling leadership stays in power by frightening its own citizens, um, and they've managed to get to the point now they have bombs and they have rockets and they have the capability to send a nuclear weapon to Hawaii anytime they want. Probably also to the west coast of the U.S. Um, and that makes and the United States treats them with more respect now, right? Um, Israel, in the context of Middle East politics, Israel has always had nuclear weapons as a threat, but there's also the problem. Why would Russia never use its nuclear weapons in the Russia-Ukraine war?
I mean, it's just too close.
Yeah, it's just too close, right? It wouldn't work. They threatened to send them to the U.S. So in the Middle East, quickly get to the point where many countries have nuclear weapons, but no one can really use them because they'll destroy themselves if they're rational about it. There's also a concept. There's different ways to phrase it. I would call it nuclear ready states,
Mhm.
and these are countries that do not have nuclear weapons, but they have the fissile material, they have the plutonium, they have the plans, they have the pieces, they have people trained, and within a few months, they could have atomic bombs. And this includes, peaceful countries you think as peaceful like Sweden, yeah, and Japan. And I think that part of it, it's a different level of deterrent. They don't have nuclear weapons, but um, other countries know that if they needed to and they had 6 months, they could have them, which is another whole layer below the countries who obviously have them.
Right.
And of course, the political alliances of NATO and what used to exist in the Warsaw Pact. Um, Already in the 1950s, for example, West Germany was banned from doing nuclear research and banned from developing anything because the whole carryover from the Nazi period. But there were already American nuclear weapons in West Germany. Because any country that was in NATO, there are nuclear weapons there. Now, whether depend as to which country owns them, in most of these NATO countries, they use the two key method. That is, um, the nuclear weapons in West Germany, there are two keys and two chairs next to each other. One is a West German, or now it's a German. One is an American soldier, and they both have to turn the key for it to go. And so the Germans don't have both keys. The Americans have one of the keys, but the Americans don't have both keys. See, and that was the technological compromise for West Germany wanted its own nuclear weapons, but no one thought that was a good idea. And the Americans said that we will put our nuclear weapons in there, but you have some control over it. France, of course, developed nuclear weapons in part to show the world that it was an independent global power. Um,
Mhm.
um, and Britain still holds on to nuclear weapons and nuclear submarines for that reason, even though they only have a small number of them. Um, but I think that almost many countries have nuclear power, nuclear weapons. Fortunately, no one's used one in anger since 1945. They're not, so nuclear weapons aren't necessarily that useful. They're good to deter attack on you, but it's not clear what else. Now, I've often wondered, again, the Russia-Ukraine war, that can a nuclear power lose a war? Because there's a limit to how far countries can push Russia. If you
Right.
really threaten Russia's existence, well, then they would have no problem with using nuclear weapons, right?
Right.
The US had nuclear weapons when it left Vietnam, but it didn't leave Vietnam because of the Vietnamese. It left Vietnam because of American public opinion. Yeah.
Yeah. And sort of piggybacking off that, how do you think the public perception of these nuclear technologies, whether it be nuclear energy or nuclear weapons, has evolved since its development? And do you think that there's a large contrast between, I guess, the American perspective and the non-American perspective?
Well, starting with America already in the 1960s, of course, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, um, and you can see, you go to YouTube, you can find Kennedy's speech he gave to the country, and it scared people, and it should have scared people, right? People thought this is it. Um, and then there was also Kennedy gave on behalf of his government, a bomb shelter speech. It was very male oriented. The male breadwinner of the family should seriously consider whether he protects his family by building a bomb shelter. The government's not going to pay for it. You have to pay for it yourself, but you should do that. And most people didn't build bomb shelters because they would have been very expensive and pointless, and most people didn't see how it would help. But what the interesting thing is, people were doing surveys in this for the course of the 60s, and people, as time passes, even as Americans and the Soviets are adding more and more nuclear weapons, Americans are thinking about them less and less. However, there is still this fear, and historians have argued that's one reason why this fear is tapped when nuclear power plant accidents happen. But there is something called this idea of cognitive dissonance, that trying to hold in your head two things that just don't fit together. So the world could end tomorrow if someone starts a nuclear war, but I need to get up and go to work, right?
Right.
And what I think has happened in America, but with some differences worldwide, is you just can't scare people about something over and over again. People repress it and tune it out. Um, it comes back after 9/11. There was this um, fear, which we now know is completely manufactured and had no basis in fact, that terrorists would use these so-called dirty bombs. You get very radioactive materials and surround them with like high explosives and go to city centers in the U.S. and blow them up. It'd be horrible. Um, we now know that was pure speculation, but that bubbled up after a while. Now, if you go to Japan, Japanese have a very different attitude toward this, of course, and for political reasons, they very much cultivate the fact that they're the victims. For one thing, it's allowed them to never have to talk very much about the various atrocities they committed in World War II. Um, um, but Japan also went in big for nuclear power. It might seem ironic, but the reason, of course, Japan doesn't have oil or natural gas, and they really need electricity, right? Um, and Japan is very close to North Korea, and North Korea regularly shoots missiles over Japan, missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, and if they can shoot a missile over Japan, then obviously they could shoot a missile into Japan. Um, so the Japanese have I think are more, it's more in their consciousness. I don't think Americans really think consciously about the threat of nuclear war anymore, even though it has not gotten the tiniest bit safer.
Right.
And nuclear power plant accidents, we really only think about them when A, they happen, or B, someone says, "Hi, I'd like to build one in your backyard." And I know that um, I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and there's a wind farm company that contacted my siblings and I about putting wind turbines on the farm. And there's a surprisingly strong, find quite irrational resistance to it among some local people. Um, uh, and this is a new threat. But if you'd ask them, what about nuclear weapons? They say, I can't do anything about that.
Well, Dr. Walker, thank you so much for this conversation. It was really so insightful. But now we're going to be turning this over to Naman, who will continue this conversation of nuclear power with Dr. Casey Williams.
So, we're all familiar with the general history of the atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US at the tail end of World War II, but many people might not know that Godzilla was a direct response to the threat of nuclear annihilation from the uniquely Japanese perspective. Can you elaborate on how Japanese fears of nuclear destruction were echoed through the story of the original Godzilla movie?
Sure. It's hard to overstate the national trauma that Japan experienced at the end of World War II with the dropping of the atomic bombs by the US on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as you mentioned. In addition to those A-bomb attacks, which killed around 300,000 people, the US also firebombed major cities in Japan, including Tokyo, destroying a huge portion of the city and killing 100,000 people. And by the end of World War II, almost 2 million people in Japan had been killed as a result of conflict with the US. And this left a lasting impression on the national consciousness in many countries, including Japan. And so there were a number of films that came out after 1946 that addressed the consequences of the bombing. Godzilla is particularly interesting for a couple of reasons. One, the director Ishiro Honda developed it as a kind of direct commentary or allegory about the bombings. And he got the idea for the initial premise of the film from an event that happened in 1954. There was a Japanese fishing boat called the Lucky Dragon, which stumbled upon the US hydrogen bomb tests in the Marshall Islands. And they weren't expecting it. They were just kind of out there fishing. And all of a sudden, there was a giant flash in the sky, and it ended up causing several of the crew members to develop cancer. So when Honda heard about this story, he got the idea for a film that would wrestle with the legacy of the atomic bombings by imagining that bomb test produced a monster that menaces Japan. And in some ways, the idea of Godzilla is as an embodiment, not just a metaphor, but an embodiment of the terror of the nuclear attacks. And part of the way we see that embodiment is in Godzilla's kind of mute compulsion, its lack of any sense of kind of animal agency, anything that you can empathize with. It's something that just sort of produces destruction in wave after wave, despite all of the military attempts to prevent it, and emphasizes and kind of reproduces on the screen this sense of total fear that comes from a source of annihilation that you just have no control over. So those are some of the initial ways I would say the film addresses these nuclear anxieties.
So, when the American edit of Godzilla was released shortly following the success of the Japanese movie, it had a uniquely upbeat ending that differs from the somber tone of the original Japanese ending. In fact, we see entire sections that directly reference the aftermath of World War II and the atomic bombings erased to include an American reporter character. What do you think this reveals about the American attitude at the time? And how does it differ from the Japanese view or even the view of the rest of the world?
Yeah, it's interesting. So the American edit, and that American edit with the actor Raymond Burr was the only US version of the film we had until 2004. So American viewers didn't actually see the original Japanese version until 2004. And as you said, that edit excised most of the references to the atomic bombings that were in the original film. It didn't excise all of them, and that's important. So it wasn't a complete denial of the bombings or their significance, but it was a minimization of them for sure. The main difference actually comes at the end, as you allude to, when after there's a character named Dr. Serizawa who uses a weapon called the oxygen destroyer to kill Godzilla. In the Japanese version, the ending, there's a shot of the older professor, Professor Yamane, saying, if we continue to test hydrogen bombs, then there will be more Godzillas. So suggesting that there's still a threat out there, that we need to be cautious about our development of military technology, and that we need to learn some lessons from this if we want the cycle of destruction to end. In the American version, the Raymond Burr's character says, it's great, we did it, we can, quote, wake up and live again. So it's a very heroic ending that presumes that the cycle of violence has been concluded by the use of the oxygen destroyer to kill Godzilla. And it's revealing of the different attitudes in the US and Japan about nuclear testing and weapons. In the American case, there's a sense that this trauma is behind us, right? That we can move on, that technology is actually a solution to the excesses or malignant applications of military technology in the past. Whereas in the Japanese film, there's very much a sense that if we don't learn some deeper lessons about how we're developing technology, how we're using it for military purposes, then we risk reproducing the same kinds of destructive consequences in the future. So it's not that the Japanese ending is less hopeful necessarily. It's just that it presents a different and I would say more sober reflection on what it would actually take to rein in some of the most destructive consequences of, military technology that's being developed at the time.
We see that future iterations of Godzilla are not necessarily a response to the threat of nuclear annihilation, but rather align with other contemporary movements such as environmentalism. What do you think this reveals about the current cultural perspective on nuclear weapons and energy, as well as the current nuclear landscape?
Well, to the first part of that question, it's important to remember that science fiction in general, and especially science fiction texts that stage some kind of catastrophe that whether it's an alien invasion or the creation of some kind of monster as a result of technology, they're really screens onto which viewers project anxieties that are latent within a given culture. So their allegorical function, their ability to stand in for something in particular, really has to do with the historical moment in which those fictions are being developed and shown and also received by viewers. So I think you're right. I think that the acute sense of nuclear anxiety, particularly, which was widespread not only in Japan, but also in the US and other parts of the world after World War II, has diminished somewhat as the threat of nuclear conflict appears to recede, at least from the kind of immediate political discussion. At the same time, other kinds of ecological catastrophes, especially, have become more salient for viewers. I think climate change, as well as biodiversity loss and some of the other macro ecological consequences of our use of fossil fuels and the way that we develop the land and so on, these are becoming really salient for viewers. And so you see those anxieties about climate change, about what it's going to mean to live in a world that's several degrees hotter than the one we currently live in, projected onto even some of these really classic science fiction characters like Godzilla. Now, there are lots of specific kind of climate fictions out there. And in fact, there's a whole new genre. It's called climate fiction that deals really specifically with potential climate-related threats. But yeah, even Godzilla movies, or sometimes even Marvel movies, which aren't really science fiction, they're fantasy, are are ways of expressing anxieties that we have about ecological catastrophe and kind of negotiating them. So testing out different potential responses or different theories of what's causing it or what might solve it. And that, and I would say, one of the reasons that Godzilla movies keep being remade, and they're remade like every 5 years almost.
It's a lot.
Is because Godzilla in particular has proved to be a really durable screen onto which we can project a range of social ecological anxieties.
Thank you for all of these insightful responses to my questions. Those are all the questions that I had, but before we go, is there anything that you wanted to add?
Maybe just a couple additional points. One is that, it's important to note that Godzilla is as much a critique of Japan's militarism as it is a critique of American militarism. So, even though Japanese cities were the targets of these bombings, there has long been, and in this movie is reflected, a strong critique of Japan's imperialism and its role in building up and accelerating military conflict at the time. So it has a kind of inward focus as well, even as it is a critique of US bombing. So that's just important to emphasize. The nuclear allegory in Godzilla is really explicit. Like, you don't have to hunt very hard for it. And in an interview after he made it, the director Ishiro Honda said that he applied the characteristics of the atomic bomb to Godzilla. He was trying to create a character that embodied, the terror of this form of total destruction. And as you said, there are many direct references to the bombing in the film. And even though it's in some ways, kind of campy disaster movie, like the special effects look kind of dumb from our 2024 perspective, there are moments of real pathos in the film too. And I think it's important to treat it as a way of really plumbing the kind of psychological and emotional consequences of the war and of the bomb as well, as opposed to just focusing on the big, spectacular destruction of cities part of it.
And lastly, we'll hear from Sophia Soltz, who will let you know how you can get involved in Houston this week.
Hi everyone, it's Sophia, and if you're interested in learning about and helping the environment, I've got some perfect opportunities for you to get involved with environmental initiatives in the area this week. The first great opportunity that I have for y'all is the Air Alliance Houston Open House and Fundraiser on Tuesday, December 3rd from 4 to 7 p.m. This event will involve a silent auction, an online auction, and a raffle. So if you're interested in supporting an invaluable local organization and possibly winning a couples massage, sweet tickets to the Houston Texans on Christmas Day, or a variety of options in between, consider attending this fundraiser. More information can be found on the Air Alliance Houston events website, including where this event will be held. If you want to switch the focus from air quality to the prevalent issue of microplastics, consider attending a screening of the documentary Plastic People: The Hidden Crisis of Microplastics, created by a critically acclaimed author and science journalist, Zia Tong. This event will be held on Wednesday, December 4th, from 6 to 9 p.m., and if you attend, there will also be a panel discussion with water and microplastics experts who are eager to share their knowledge with you. If you will be attending this screening, please make sure to reserve a seat on the Environment Texas Research and Policy Center website. If you're interested in applying your newfound knowledge for good, make sure to add the first Saturday Boulevard Flats Beach Rambles event to your calendar. This event will take place from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. on Saturday, December 7th. And at the Boulevard Flats Shorebird Sanctuary, you will be able to see dolphins, birds, and shellfish, along with learning about coastal ecosystems from conservation specialist Wyatt Eaglehoff. This event requires a $10 parking pass, so make sure to check out the instructions for how to obtain the pass on the Houston Autobahn website. In addition, make sure to visit the Houston Autobahn page to learn more about this opportunity to get your whole family outside and learning on a Saturday. Thank you for listening, and make sure to tune in again next week for more ways to get involved.
Thanks, Sophia.
Up next on Gulf Streams, we're talking about birds and natural observation. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westont@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on all Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enrique, original music by Carter Dean, research support provided by Jaden Brayboys, Sophia Soltz, and Naman Retzendor. Stay tuned for the R&R show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT. Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.